Hello and welcome back to Future You, the podcast brought to you by graduate careers experts Prospects. I'm your host, Emily Slade, and in this episode I chat to Helen Garcia, who rejoins me to discuss her role as an ADHD coach.
Okay, so I'm Helen Garcia. I'm an ADHD coach, strategies and communication. I'm an accredited and qualified coach, so accredited with the Association for Coaching and a qualifying diploma, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but also qualified as a professional ADHD coach.
So what drew you to become an ADHD coach in the first place, and then what process did you take to become one?
Okay, so my coaching life started back in 2017. So it started really around the agile coach side of things. So I trained properly as a Scrum Master, and we've got a podcast on that. And in Scrum Mastery, there's a percentage of your job that really sort of looks at team coaching. So you're helping the team look at their processes and improve them. And part of what I found out about was actually, we've got all these processes in place, but we're still having this pressure and this stress on the team, and actually their well-being is perhaps not the best that it could be. So I started to look a little bit more into coaching. So in 2020, I started a diploma in coaching, and I qualified in 2022. And it was a really, really good course that I'd done, which was around, you looked at multiple different areas. So you looked at stress, you looked at psychology of coaching, you looked at the differences between coaching and therapy, as well as counselling. You looked at communication, just multiple different things, which were really good. And also cognitive behavioural coaching, which I found particularly interesting because it's around, how do our cognitions, our thoughts impact our behaviours, and how, if we change the way we think, could we change the way that we behave, which is actually quite interesting in terms of ADHD and the link to ADHD. So not only agile coaching, which is around, breaking things down in small bite-sized pieces, and in my mind, making things fun to get things done. You also have this cognitive behavioural link as well around, okay, so especially in women with ADHD, it can be very noisy in your head. How can we start to look at that in order to support our behaviours in the day-to-day? So that was really great. And then I met a lady called Estelle Barrett, and she was just really inspiring for me. So she's an ADHD coach, and she's got quite a lot of experience, and was talking about the different traits and symptoms of ADHD. And as she was talking for, I think it was an hour or 2 hours, I just couldn't stop being like, oh my God, this is me. Like everything that you're talking about, I can just relate in so many ways, which was a real light bulb moment for me, actually, because I felt quite alone and quite disorganized and just not really knowing what was going on with me. Like I felt a little like I was going mad. And then I guess the past 5 years generally through that coaching journey have been quite difficult, because you do a lot of reflection, you do a lot of self-development, and you discover a lot about yourself, which is difficult and challenging at times. But I stopped doing certain things. I stopped doing a lot of exercise, for example, and I'll come back to why that is important in a minute. But I became quite depressed. My anxiety levels just rocketed. I'd moved house, I'd moved job. I had a whole ton of things that were going on. And actually, my day-to-day was really becoming quite unmanageable. Going to the doctors and trying to describe this, going to therapists that didn't really understand ADHD, just basically came down to, well, you're just, you're stressed and you're a little bit depressed. So I had all of this going on, and to a point where I heard about Esther's running a course, a ran a course in January this year. And it was finally kind of meeting people that were like me and that had that, I don't know, the same sort of vibe, because there is a lot of things. It's not just about being, distracted and hyperactive. It's many things in between that. So for 3 months, I learned about ADHD. I learned about strategies and tools that could support my ADHD, which was amazing. I finally got the guts to get actually a private diagnosis, which came out as dyslexia and as attention deficit, or ADD as it used to be known as. And this was like the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was like, oh my God, I now have an answer It's not, yeah, of course I'm depressed and anxious. My God, like with everything going on, I definitely that. I mean, the doctors weren't wrong, right? But being prescribed medication just for that is definitely wasn't the answer. So after that, I qualified as an ADHD coach, obviously with life experience in it as well. And I decided I never want anybody else to go through what I'm going through, because the spiral is really, it's very depressive. I mean, you can go from being, on top of the moon to be suicidal, and that's horrible. And actually, that isn't normal, and it's okay, and we should talk about it more. And I don't want other people to go through that. So that's why I made that change, was like, you know what, I need to make my focus different now. I need to support professionals in thriving and not just trying to survive the day to day.
Yeah, fantastic. That's brilliant. So you've sort of touched on it there in terms of what does the role entail. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I'm not sure if it's necessarily qualifying as it is a role, it is
Mm.
in a sense, but it's obviously quite difficult because we don't necessarily at this point in time, being 2025, have ADHD coaches within organisations. I think if that is a route that people want to go down as a starter, then the sort of thing that I did was, hey guys, I have ADHD. I want to raise awareness about it because there's multiple things and multiple strengths that we can bring, and there's different things that we can do in organizations to help people. But also, I want to be actively doing that because it is hard in the coaching world to just suddenly have a coaching business and, thrive off of that and be able to live off of it. So
Mm.
that's the first step. I think I'd probably add to that in terms of, is it a role at the moment? No. Do I have a vision for it to be a role? I really hope so. That would be amazing in the future if actually we could have not ADHD coaches, but neurodiversity coaches pinned within companies to be able to support the people that are there. The other thing, I guess, just to touch on is around the role, and I think it's important, is coaching itself is very much based around values. And I think this is what drew me to coaching in the first place when I started with my Scrum Mastery and team coaching, is it was all based around values. And to understand yourself and your values is really important. So it's not a role in the sense that you are trained and then you are a coach and you're a great coach and you can help people. I think it's a lot more than that. It involves a lot of self-development. So I think that probably isn't the standard answer when you come to a role, like what is it that you do your day to day, but it is part of that, learning yourself
Mhm.
and learning how to grow and develop. I think another part of the role as well is understanding your boundaries, being really able to put a sort of ring fence your boundaries, because you come across lots of different types of problems. And in the coaching world, just generically, obviously, I'm a strong believer in coaching is looking at the now and the future, and how actually we can be better at, or we can make life easier in the future if we are able to adapt and use different strategies and tools to put in place. And it's not about looking at the past. And it can be difficult in coaching to not do that, because somebody comes with you and they sort of offload, and sometimes they can go down. So knowing your boundaries, saying, the coaching is about this. And I understand this is obviously a very difficult situation, but how can we start to look forward? How can we put things in place in order to do that? Because it becomes a very fine line to therapy and counselling if you start to look back. And actually, as coaches, we're not equipped or qualified to be able to deal with that. So I think that's a good call out in terms of, the role of what it entails around your boundaries and your values. There's other things I think that are also important as coaching, and obviously self-employment can be quite lonely. So in your role, again, another important thing is if you want to go into coaching, you want to sort of take that path, is there are so many things that you can learn about within coaching. There's so many communities, meetups, actually, there was the first ADHD conference this year that, again, Esther Barrett and her team ran. And there's one next year. Well, I don't think the date's come out for that yet, but going to these things and really learning from your peers, because everybody has such a different way of coaching and a different, there's so many different types of coaches out there that actually it's great to be able to speak and learn from others. And I think I'd recommend that for all types of roles and all types of careers, but especially when it's one that could be quite siloed. And sort of moving on from that as well, around supervision. especially as an ADHD coach. Obviously with ADHD, you're dealing with various different things, and ADHD it has been shown, I think, in research that there can be trauma. And from trauma, sometimes you can develop some ADHD around it. Lots of other things kind of circle around that. So you're dealing with quite serious issues sometimes, although you're saying, we're here now, we're looking to the future of how we can change that. There's a history of that, right? There's a history for a person. So making sure that you go to supervision on a regular basis, and not only for your coachees and their well-being and their journey, but also your own as well, because it can be quite rewarding, but also quite draining. And as an accredited coach, you actually have to have supervision. So it's based on a percentage of the amount of coaching you do, or in my case, I just like to have supervision every sort of two to three months, or as and when I need to.
Let's now veer into understanding ADHD itself a bit more. So how does it present itself, and how can it impact the workplace? And I imagine there's not going to be a one-word answer for this.
No. And actually, it's an interesting question, actually, because you're right. There's not a one-word answer. There's not, a one presentation meets all. And I think especially between male and sort of female presentation of ADHD can be different, not always. But it's thought to be that around men, it's probably a little bit more presented outwardly. So there's a lot more energy, maybe a lot more, I'd say a lot more energy is probably a fair way to describe it. And for women, some of that hyperactivity is actually within the head. So it's very noisy in the head rather than outside of the head, which does present differently. And I think for quite a long time, it was just presumed that men had ADHD because it was a lot more obvious in that sense. And actually, that's obviously not the case. Anybody can get ADHD, or have ADHD, I should say. So that's one thing. I think a lot of the time we also focus on some of the elements that are quite obvious, like people talk about, the AD being attention deficit, so being distracted, hyperactivity being, maybe a bit more impulsive, hyperactive. Potentially that could look at sort of disorganization, but I like to focus more on what are the different ways that we think in comparison maybe to a neurotypical person. Obviously, we're all diverse as people. We're all that's just a natural sort of way of our being. But particularly for ADHDers, like, we have the ability to have quite divergent thinking, which is really exciting because actually that brings like novel and new approaches to the way that we can see things. So it's not always that linear path, the way that we think. It is could be more of a, I don't know, I like to describe this in a numerical fashion of, neurotypical might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, being a bit more linear. In my head, it might be 7, 140, 20, 38, 9. But the beauty of that is that you do see things differently, and particularly in complex or chaotic environments, I work really well. And the opposite, I guess, sometimes I can create complex and chaotic environments because it kind of suits me, but it may not suit other people, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think there's definitely helpful and unhelpful things about that.
Yeah. Clearly, like, for centuries now, people will have been neurodiverse, and they just would have gone undiagnosed and sort of lived through the workplace with that. So before people started getting diagnosis, and before people started understanding how their brains worked and were able to reach out and get this sort of support, were they just sort of 50% of the workforce having to like figure it out themselves? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make total sense. I think it's a really good question. So I think I was doing a bit of Googling on this. I'm like, how big of the population does have ADHD, do we think? And it came up to 3.6% of the population that they think is estimated to have ADHD at this point in time. So it's still a really, really small percentage. But like you said, it's the not recognizing that and having the ability, I think we talk about, if you've heard of masking, a lot. So basically you're fight, you're, I'm saying, I guess I think it would be fair that you're kind of fighting your natural behaviors in order to be like, no, I can do this. I can work in a 9 to 5 organization. I can deal with the noise around me. I can deal with somebody say to me, do you think you could just get this done? Not giving you a deadline. And so you start to mask, some of those behaviors, which in theory, for a little while, actually, when I was learning about ADHD, I was like, well, what's really the problem with that? Because then surely that means you're just kind of behaving a bit more, put in inverted commas, normal. But the problem with that is that it's really training. So part of my story is really, I suppose even about 9 months ago, it might even be before then, I was having to start to go to bed in the afternoon, and I'd get terrible, terrible headaches. I'd have to go to sleep. If anything was like too exciting or too stressful for me, because for years and years and years, I'd just been pretending that I could do multiple things, and I could have one social event after another after a hard day at work, and maybe somebody just dropping something on my desk at the last minute. And all of those things would be like, no, it's totally fine. But actually, it was having an impact on me that I didn't realize was quite detrimental to my well-being. Because when you're, I consider myself quite young. Um, and I don't feel like I should be having to, have these moments, these massive burnout moments where I just need to go to bed because actually I can't put a sentence together. It's those sorts of impacts and it has on you. So you might appear to be normal and, let's say, functioning in 9 to 5 at work, but outside of those hours, how is that person surviving? And what we really want is people at work. It's not just come to work because it's a job, but actually thriving and being in an environment that really energizes that person and helps them, live a good life, which
Yeah.
is both inside and outside. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it does. It makes complete sense. And it leads quite nicely actually into what advice do you have for workplaces to help support their neurodivergent staff?
Yes, yeah. So I think this is an interesting one because often when I speak with organisations about supporting their staff, often there's this, okay, so we need to give spaces for ADHDers or neurodiverse people to be able to get away, sit in a silent room, or be able to dim the lights, or have different kind of furnishings or textures or things like that. And I'm not poo-pooing technical word, those things. That's all really good. Like, that is a good thing to do, right? That's helpful because it does give space. But why are we not thinking broader than that? Because actually, we need to be thinking, well, as a manager, if I'm a manager with ADHD or a manager who has ADHD employees or colleagues, then how do I actually communicate with that person? And how can I help that person communicate with me? Because I believe it's a two-way thing. We often talk about, obviously we've been living in a, let's call it neurotypical world for many years. We need to make changing, yes, but we also need to understand how other people like to communicate. Because I know for myself, sometimes I can come across quite direct and quite maybe sometimes brutal. And if somebody communicated with me direct and brutal, like that could like break me. I could be, destroyed by that, which is really ironic. So how do we have that two-way communication sort of understanding in place? So supporting organizations to understand that. And I think for things like that, it's just, let's have the conversation. Let's not be frightened to say, as part of our maybe onboarding, what is it? If you're, ADHD or autistic or some part of that, neurodiverse community, then what these are the ways that we understand communication will help. What would help for you, kind of thing. And if people aren't comfortable with coming out and talking about it, and I totally understand that as well, because it can be very scary, then just naturally, let's just talk to people in a way that they want to communicate. Let's just ask the question, how do you like to be managed? How do you like to be communicated to? Rather than saying, this is how we like to do it. And, every year we have an annual review. Well, that might be terrifying for somebody with ADHD, because you don't know what's going to happen, because have we stacked up a whole load of things just for that year's review? Like, there's so many different things. It can be
Mhm.
it can be a bit scary. So I think one thing is around communication. Um, the second thing is, and I still haven't quite worked out or quite managed to convince people of this, but especially for the ADHD brain, making things fun to get stuff done is a real is just a massive tick in the box, right? So my motto, especially as a Scrum Master, Agile coach, team coach, is having fun whilst getting stuff done. That's what I say, and I've had that like 2 decades. And I've never really understood what, because I thought, well, boring stuff, I'm just not interested in. Literally, you cannot get to do a bill. I know everybody finds stuff like that boring, but it's like I don't know how to describe it. I'm almost paralyzed by boring things. I just
Mhm.
cannot move forward with them. And that's really, obviously, in a workplace, you can't just say, I'm never going to do a boring thing. That's just not feasible. And they'll expect that in a company, right? But I was talking to a coach the other day, and they're just, oh, I just find all these numbers really boring. And I said, oh, is there anybody in your team that actually really loves numbers? Because there might be an ADHD or actually anybody in that team who just gets really get a buzz out of looking at numbers and finding stuff like that. Well, why don't you just say, you either want to work on it together, or do you want to do this? Because I know that you find this fun. So why do we why are we still we have JDs, right? We have just job descriptions. We have, the goal in which we want to achieve in our day to day. But it doesn't mean that we can't say, well, these are the really fun things in my job that I love doing. I understand I will have sprinkling of boring stuff. But the stuff that is actually paralyzing to me, why am I taking that away from somebody who actually might really enjoy it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 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 that makes sense.
Um,
So just that more completely flexible way of working, where you look at the team in front of you and you delegate accordingly instead of just by job description, as you say.
Yeah, I think that would be brilliant. And this comes back to that sort of agile way of working or cross-functional teams, right? But again, you've got your, T-shaped person, so you've got a core skill, but is there an opportunity to actually share out at work? Right? Exactly. Let's make things fun so that we actually feel more energized at work. And also, surely that's just much better. You don't want to get out of bed and be like, oh God, I've got to look at another spreadsheet today, or I've got to go to another 100 meetings. You might get out of bed being like, yeah, I've got to do this, but I've got all of these, 90%, 70% of my day is actually going to be really interesting and something that, lights a fire in me.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And then finally, where do you see ADHD awareness and support heading in the future?
So I really hope that there is a role for sort of neurodiversity coaching or ADHD coaching in the workplace. I hope that people actually feel they can talk about their differences and can actually be proud of saying that my brain is different, and the reason it's different is because maybe it falls into this, let's label it whatever it needs to be, but actually the benefits of that are this, that and the other. So it would be so cool to see on even job descriptions, like, we're looking for a divergent thinker, for someone who's good at over focusing, someone who's able to recognize patterns. um all of these things are actually stuff that we're really good at, and being able to have that as helpful sort of indications to a diverse workplace, I think would be really great. um I think, again, sort of coming back to your previous question around the what can organizations do for people with ADHD, it's like I say, it's not just about actually ADHD and autism around colors and noise and many other things. I think it's also about that diversity of ideas. So, I can sometimes come with an idea and say it to a room of people, and everybody sort of goes quiet because it's probably a little bit wayward, and I've got there in a way that maybe I haven't explained very well. But rather than saying, oh, that's a bit wayward, let's keep going along this 1, 2, 3, 4 linear way, actually embracing that and saying, okay, so we don't have to do my idea, right? But let's explore a little bit more. So let's explore more crazy fun ideas and see where we come out with that, rather than just taking the normal path. So I suppose in short, I'm saying, shall we be more experimental, and having that in our organizations, because that is supporting the future of, you know, ADHD and true diversity and true sort of inclusion across the board. It's not just, we need to talk about this more, or we need to be aware that we have ADHD colleagues. No, it's actually practically doing something different about it.
Yeah. Fantastic. If people want to reach out to you, if they've got questions or they want to learn more about what you do, can they get in touch?
Yes, absolutely. So you can either get in touch with through LinkedIn. So I'll send you my LinkedIn, and please do connect, follow me on there, drop me a DM. Otherwise, my website is www.helen-garcia.com. And you can also connect with me there. And I would love to speak to more people. There's a lot of us out there, regardless of whether you're diagnosed, not diagnosed. But there's certainly a lot of things that we can put in place to support your day-to-day to thrive.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Emily. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you again, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks again to Helen for their time. For more information on the role of an ADHD coach, you can get in touch with Helen through the links in the description. For more information on neurodiversity in the workplace, head to prospects.ac.uk. If you enjoyed the episode, do feel free to leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Thank you, as always, for listening, and good luck on your journey to future you.